Week 12 of the fantasy football season, and his running back start sits this week. The first start, Derrick Henry of the Tennessee Titans. I know Derrick Henry the last 2 weeks, he really hasn't done much on the ground, and he's behind one of the worst offensive lines in the league. And I thought the change to Will Levis at quarterback could open the field up a little bit more and the running game for Derrick Henry, but that obviously hasn't been the case. Offensive line not blocking well, and Levis, he's made some bad decisions over the last few weeks, but this week a great matchup versus the Carolina Panthers that give up the second most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So I think Derrick Henry could get back on track this week. It's a good matchup, and I still think he's a top 10, top 15 running back. I know, like I said, the numbers are down this season, but this week here in a good matchup, Henry bounces back. Next start, Kyren Williams, Los Angeles Rams. So Kyren Williams, he's going to come off injured reserve. I know Darrell Henderson had a decent ball game in last week's victory versus the Seattle Seahawks, but right now, Kyren Williams, he was an explosive back and one of the better running backs, believe it or not, in fantasy football. And now this week, a good matchup in his return at the Arizona Cardinals that give up the third most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So hopefully Williams, he comes back, gets at least 15, 20 touches per game. And if Cooper Kupp's going to miss this game as well, you know, they're going to rely on the run game a little bit more, I think, is this Los Angeles Ram team. And Williams, we know, is a decent receiver out of the backfield. So as long as he's back and active and ready to go, I like Kyren as a start this week. Next start, DeAndre Swift of the Philadelphia Eagles. So the Eagles, I know it's a tougher matchup versus the Buffalo Bills, but you can run on this Buffalo Bill team. We've seen it over the last few weeks where Javonte Williams ran on them on that Monday night game in Week 10, and we saw last week Breece Hall have a solid game. So I think DeAndre Swift gets on track in this game. It could be a potential shootout between the Eagles and the Bills. And I think this Bill team now, after a nice ball game in the Week 11 victory versus a tough New York Jet defense, their offense is back on track as well. So right now, DeAndre Swift in a decent matchup and a team you can run on, I have as a start. Rachaad White the next start as well. And Rachaad White, the last month of the season, he's putting up fantasy points, at least 17 or more fantasy points in PPR leagues. One of the best receiving backs out of the backfield. I know early in the season he got off to a slow start, but Baker Mayfield's looking for him a lot on checkdowns in between the tackles. He hasn't been great, but still serviceable there. But receiving the football and getting 90% of the touches for the most part. No competition over there in Tampa Bay. So on work volume alone and his catching prowess and a good matchup at the Indianapolis Colts, I like Rachaad White once again as a start. Next start, Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons. It's been a mixed bag of results in his rookie season for Bijan Robinson, but we know he's an explosive back, and he was taken 4th overall for a reason in the NFL draft. So after a bye week, usually rookie players, they break out and get more piece of the offense. I think Bijan Robinson this week versus Saints, Desmond Ridder back in there quarterback, which I don't agree with this Atlanta Falcon team. I think Robinson's going to get force-fed a little bit. They got to give him the football a little bit more. And coming off the bye now, there should be no excuses, and he should be getting minimum 15, 20 touches per game because he's one of the better receivers out of the backfield as well, I believe, is Bijan Robinson. Next start, Isaiah Pacheco of the Kansas City Chiefs. So a great matchup at the Vegas Raiders where you can run on this Raider team. And obviously teams are focused on stopping Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce. So Pacheco, we know he's one of the harder runners in the game where every down he's trying to run through a brick wall, it seems like, when he carries the football. And it's been a great season for him, no doubt about it. I know the last few weeks the numbers have taken a little bit of a dip for Pacheco, but this week at Vegas, I think he has a good game. And the final running back to start's Jerome Ford of the Cleveland Browns. Jerome Ford, he's been a nice fill-in, no doubt about it, for Nick Chubb after he went out early in the season with the ACL injury. And this week, a good matchup on paper at the Denver Broncos that give up the most rushing yards to running backs on the season. We saw Ty Chandler run for 7.3 yards per carry in last week's game. Madison had 81 yards on the ground. So they're giving up a lot of yards to Denver, at least over 120 yards per game to running backs. So Ford, we know he's got home run hitting ability. I know teams are going to force Thompson Robinson to try to beat him, but Ford weekly, pretty much you could pencil him in 10 to 15 fantasy points. And now the sits Najee Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Najee Harris, it's been an up and down season once again, but Jaylen Warren has been the more explosive back, and we saw him once again that Week 11 game at the Cleveland Browns. And Najee Harris, he's been a touchdown-dependent running back, and if he's not doing that, he's pretty much not doing anything for fantasy owners this season. He's not really catching the football out of the backfield. The burst really hasn't been there. And now with Warren getting more touches and pretty much a 50-50 split, it's been the last few weeks. He's on the decline, and a sit. Javonte Williams, the next sit for me. Williams, I know he's had a good span of games until last week where he only had 7.30 fantasy points in that victory versus the Minnesota Vikings. And this week here, a tough matchup versus the Browns. They give up the fifth least amount of fantasy points to running backs on the season. So Williams, he's not really much of a catch passer out of the backfield. They got P. Ryan and Jaleel McLaughlin as the passing down back and third down back over there for this Denver Bronco team. So I know this is going to be a tight game in between the trenches for the most part, but I just don't like the matchup. And like I said, he's not getting a lot of third down work. Is Williams, where if they're playing with a lead, is where his value is. Next sits Kareem Hunt staying in the same game of the Cleveland Browns. So Jerome Ford is the better running back in my opinion, better catch passer out of the backfield, more burst, more home run ability. And we even saw Ford in last week's game get a goal line touch and find the end zone. So this week here, I know Denver, like I said, gives up the most points to running backs on the season, but Kareem Hunt, even in a plus matchup, is tough to trust in my opinion, and he's a sit. James Conner, the next sit, tougher matchup versus the Los Angeles Rams. And Kyler Murray, with him back in the lineup, he's going to run the football a whole lot. And this Arizona team, they've been trailing a lot for the most part this season as well, where they're just going to have to throw the football. So the Rams, they've been pretty solid versus the run this season. Kenneth Walker, they knocked out in last week's game. And Charbonnet, in terms of yards per carry, really wasn't doing much in that one versus this Ram team. So Los Angeles, they've had a good track record versus Arizona. And this week, once again, I know Connor, he's still going to get a good workload, and most fantasy owners are going to start him. But in terms of putting up production, I don't think he's going to do that much, topping out anywhere from 8-11 fantasy points. Next, it's James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. It was good to get James Cook involved in this offense for this Buffalo Bill team, where he was doing everything, and he had 19 fantasy points in PPR leagues. But this week here, a tough matchup with the Eagles that have one of the best front lines in all pro football, and they give up the least amount of fantasy points to running backs on the season. So after a nice game for James Cook and going over 100 yards a few weeks ago versus the Broncos, this week I don't think he's going to put up numbers as James Cook. He's had fumbling issues this season, and just because of the matchup, I'm going to lower expectations, and he's a sit. And we also saw Latavius Murray and Ty Johnson get work in that game as well in Week 11. Next hits A.J. Dillon of the Green Bay Packers. Aaron Jones, he's going to be out, especially with this Thursday afternoon Thanksgiving game for the turnaround at the line. So A.J. Dillon, he's had a couple opportunities this season when Aaron Jones was out of the lineup. And even in Week 11's game, he really didn't do much. So A.J. Dillon, we know he's had some pop games throughout his career, but for the most part, he's been a running back that's tough to trust in and tough to put up consistent numbers week in and week out. So in a game where they could be trailing early and often and have to abandon the run on Thanksgiving at the Detroit Lions, A.J. Dillon is a sit for me. And the final sit's Khalil Herbert of the Chicago Bears. So it looks like Foreman most likely is going to be out, banging up that ankle injury, and then going on bye. So I'm assuming Foreman's going to be out going into this game for the Chicago Bear team. So right now, Minnesota Vikings, I know their run defense isn't all that great, but Roschon Johnson's back over there as well. And Justin Fields, we know he's going to pick his spots and run the football, where he ran for over 100 yards in that Week 11 loss at the Detroit Lions. So right now, with all those factors, and Herbert still not 100% as well, even though he did have 16 carries in last week's game, he's a sit. So that's running back start sits for Week 12 of the fantasy football season.